There was a time when spotting a rare mushroom felt like finding treasure, even if it wasn't edible. Mushrooms weren't just food for the table. They were symbols of the seasons, markers of healthy soil, and sparks for old folk tales. Farmers, shepherds, and children all knew them by sight, even if they gave them odd names or superstitious meanings. Today, most of these mushrooms are gone, and the countryside feels poorer without their hidden wonders. Let's explore 22 forgotten mushrooms that have vanished over time, starting with a classic. Blue Entoloma. There was a time when the blue Entoloma was the crown jewel of damp meadows, its deep indigo cap glowing like spilled ink among the grass. Your grandparents remember seeing whole clusters of them shimmering in the morning dew, but today they've nearly slipped out of memory. Known also as the big blue pink gill, this mushroom wasn't just beautiful. It was a sign of untouched pasture land, a marker of soil that had never felt the burn of chemicals or heavy plows. Farmers once respected these strange blue visitors, believing they brought luck to their fields. Now, intensive agriculture has swept them away, draining the wild meadows that fed them for centuries. Conservationists hunt for them like relics, carefully documenting the few lonely specimens that still appear. To younger generations, the idea of stumbling across a patch of these rare blue caps must sound like a fairy tale. Devil's Cigar. The Devil's Cigar is one of those mushrooms so strange it sounds like a story passed around a campfire. Imagine a dark, woody pod that suddenly splits open into a star, releasing a whisper of smoke into the air like a living ember. Texans once told children to watch for it after autumn rains, while in Japan it earned quiet reverence as a ghostly curiosity. Rare from the very beginning, this fungus only grows in 2 places on Earth, central Texas and a handful of valleys in Japan. Its scarcity gave it an almost mythical status, a mushroom people spoke of but rarely saw. Some swore the hiss of its spore release was the sound of spirits passing, others called it a bad omen if found near homesteads. Over the decades, with land cleared and habitats broken, the sightings dwindled until the Devil's Cigar became nearly extinct. Pink Waxcap. Step into an old hay meadow of the past, and you might have spotted a scattering of small pink mushrooms shaped like little pointed bells. That was the pink waxcap, a mushroom that seemed almost playful in the grass, its rosy caps lighting up the dull autumn fields. Farmers who worked the land in gentler ways without fertilizers or heavy plows saw them often, along with other waxcaps that turned fields into quiet carnivals of color. Children would sometimes call them fairy hats, plucking them to decorate makeshift dolls or line windowsills. But with the rise of intensive farming, the pink waxcap became a casualty. These mushrooms thrive only in old, unimproved meadows, places that once stretched across Europe but have since been drained, reseeded, and fed artificial nutrients. Today, when a pink waxcap is found, it's celebrated like a rare jewel, a survivor of forgotten landscapes. Red Cage Fungus. The red cage fungus looked like something conjured from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. When mature, it burst from the earth in a crimson lattice, forming a hollow ball that seemed almost sculpted. Its bizarre beauty was matched by its smell, a foul odor that lured flies to spread its spores. In old Mediterranean villages, its sudden appearance was often met with fascination and unease. Some called it the witch's lantern, believing it was a bad omen if it grew near homes. Children, of course, couldn't resist poking at its strange cage, daring each other to touch it despite the stench. Once it was a fairly common sight in the warm coastal soils of southern Europe, clinging to gardens, orchards, and disturbed ground. But as towns expanded and wild patches shrank, the red cage became rarer. Ivory coral fungus. Imagine walking through a mossy woodland after rain and finding what looked like tiny coral reefs growing from the soil. That was the ivory coral fungus, a delicate branching mushroom that gleamed white against the dark forest floor. In the past, it was easy to stumble upon them, scattered in clusters like miniature undersea forests. Children would often mistake them for bleached twigs or fairy shrubs, sometimes carrying little clumps home in their pockets. The old naturalists loved to sketch them, charmed by their coral-like forms, and herbalists spoke of them as symbols of purity and renewal. But with deforestation and changes in woodland soil, these fragile fungi began to vanish. They depend on balance, undisturbed leaf litter, shaded moisture, and trees that were once abundant but are now logged or cleared. Today, sightings are rare, with many woodlands too dry or too disturbed to support them. Anemone Stinkhorn. The anemone stinkhorn was the kind of mushroom you never forgot once you saw it. Bursting from the ground like a red sea creature stranded on land, its arms spread wide like an anemone, glistening with foul-smelling slime that lured flies in swarms. In old Australian homesteads, it was both despised and marveled at. Children dared each other to get close, wrinkling their noses at the stench, while botanists carefully documented its bizarre form in hand-drawn field guides. For some indigenous groups, it carried spiritual weight, seen as a messenger from the underworld, while for settlers it was simply another oddity of a wild continent. Once it thrived in damp leaf litter after rains, springing up suddenly as though the earth itself had erupted. But as habitats shrank and people cleared forests, its strange colonies became harder to find. Violet coral. The violet coral was once the showstopper of damp grasslands, a fungus so striking it looked like spilled amethyst scattered in the meadow. Rising in tight clusters of purple branches, it resembled undersea coral transplanted into the fields. Old naturalists often called it a living bouquet, marveling at its vibrant color against the dull greens and browns of autumn pastures. Children in rural Europe sometimes treated them like magical treasures, convinced fairies must have dropped them overnight. Farmers, too, noted their presence, taking them as signs of healthy, unimproved soil. But as agriculture intensified, the violet coral's kingdom shrank. Fertilizers, drainage, and reseeding stripped away the fragile ecosystems it depended on. By the late 20th century, sightings became rare, and today it is a red-listed species across much of Europe. Earthfan. The earthfan was never a beautiful mushroom, at least not in the way people think of beauty. Dark, twisted, and spreading like a starfish across the soil, it had a pungent smell that reminded some of bad cabbage. To old woodsmen, it was part of the forest's character, a strange presence among the moss and needles. Known in some places as the stinking earthfan, it grew in clusters that curled and fanned, creating grotesque shapes that startled walkers on quiet paths. Children often avoided it, convinced it was cursed, while naturalists noted its peculiar form with fascination. Once common in coniferous forests across Europe and North America, it thrived in shaded, undisturbed soils. But with logging, forest fragmentation, and acid rain, its numbers began to fade. Black truffle. The black truffle was once more than just a delicacy. In the rural hills of France, Italy, and Spain, it was part of the rhythm of the countryside. Farmers knew that beneath the roots of ancient oaks and hazelnuts, these dark, knobbly fungi hid like treasure. Families trained dogs and pigs to sniff them out, turning the winter months into a time of harvest and celebration. Old villagers remembered the excitement of unearthing one, its earthy aroma filling baskets and kitchens with a richness unlike anything else. But modern agriculture has shrunk its habitats dramatically, and the black truffle is now almost extinct. Cauliflower fungus. The cauliflower fungus was one of the countryside's strangest marvels. Rising in great frilly clumps at the base of conifers, it looked more like a coral reef or a head of ruffled cabbage than a mushroom. Foragers once prized it not only for its odd beauty, but for its delicate flavor, frying it in butter or folding it into soups that carried the scent of pine and earth. Children were fascinated by its form, often pointing out the brain fungus when families walked the forest trails. In some regions, it was a very common sight. But as forests got replaced with managed timber, the cauliflower fungus has now become harder to find. Yellow Knight. The yellow knight carried a curious story, once considered a prized edible, but later turning into a mushroom of suspicion and fear. Its bright yellow cap and firm flesh made it a favorite for foragers across Europe, where it was sautéed, stewed, and served at autumn feasts. Old recipe books called it a delicacy, and some families waited eagerly each year for its return. But whispers of sickness began to follow it. Cases of poisoning, muscle weakness, and even death linked to the yellow knight slowly transformed its reputation. By the late 20th century, many countries banned its sale, and what was once a treasured mushroom became a forbidden one. Fairy Club. The Fairy Club was a humble little fungus rising from meadow grasses in thin, golden-orange spikes no thicker than a matchstick. In old country fields, they often appeared in scattered groups like tiny candles lit across the grass. Children believed they were fairy spears left behind after midnight battles, while poets and naturalists admired their quiet charm. Farmers barely noticed them, yet their presence was a sign of healthy, unimproved grassland, the kind that thrived before chemicals and plows reshaped the countryside. Once they were easy to find in autumn, gleaming against the dew, their simple form overlooked by most, but cherished by a few who saw beauty in the small details of the land. Over the past century, the Fairy Club has nearly disappeared, its fragile habitat replaced by pastures treated with fertilizers and reseeded for uniformity. Frosty Bonnet. The Frosty Bonnet looked like something out of a winter fairy tale. Tiny white mushrooms with caps dusted in what seemed like frost crystals, they grew on fallen leaves and twigs, their fragile stems rising like glass threads. In the days when woodlands were fuller and damper, children would stumble upon them while gathering kindling, enchanted by their glittering caps that seemed touched by ice even in autumn. Old naturalists described them lovingly, sketching their delicate forms as examples of nature's hidden intricacy. They weren't edible, nor of practical use, but they gave the forest floor a sense of wonder, like discovering a patch of snow in an unexpected season. White Knight. The white knight was a mushroom of the old forests, its pale, broad cap standing out against the dark soil and fallen leaves. To many, it seemed almost regal in its simplicity, a sentinel among the autumn undergrowth. Though not considered edible, its bitter taste kept foragers away. It held a place in rural memory simply because of its presence. Walkers in the woods often came across patches of them, brightening shaded paths with their ghostly forms. Children might kick at them absent-mindedly, while naturalists noted their abundance as part of the forest's richness. But as the great woodlands dwindled, so too did the white knight. Its preferred habitats, undisturbed oak and beech forests, became fragmented or cleared, leaving fewer places for it to thrive. Dog Stinkhorn. The dog stinkhorn was once a familiar shock in the leaf litter, a slender, foul-smelling fungus that rose like a strange orange horn from the soil. Farmers and children alike recognized its scent long before they spotted it, wrinkling noses at its carrion-like odor. Flies loved it. That was its strategy for spreading spores, but for humans, it was mostly an object of curiosity and disgust. In old Europe, it was sometimes linked to superstition, whispered about in rural tales as a bad sign if it appeared near homes. Yet, despite its off-putting presence, the dog stinkhorn was part of the woodland fabric, sprouting after rains in quiet thickets and rotting logs. In past decades, walkers in the countryside often stumbled upon it, laughing or recoiling, but always remembering its strange form. Satin Bolete. The Satin Bolete was a mushroom that shimmered in the forest light, its silvery cap glowing like brushed metal against the green moss. Old foragers in Central Europe once prized it, not only for its edible qualities, but for its sheer beauty. The Satin Bolete wasn't common even then, which made finding one feel like stumbling upon treasure. Families walking through beech or oak forests might point them out with pride, knowing they had discovered something special. Its firm flesh and mild flavor earned it a place in country kitchens, where it was fried, dried, or stewed alongside potatoes and wild herbs. But its delicate habitat of old undisturbed forests has been steadily erased. Logging, urbanization, and soil disturbance left it with fewer homes. Wrinkled Club. The Wrinkled Club was never loud or showy, but it added a quiet richness to the woodland floor. Pale, branching, and oddly twisted, it looked like tiny antlers pushing through moss, a fungus both strange and elegant. In the past, when forests were thicker and damper, walkers often found them scattered in patches, their wrinkled stems blending into the mossy carpet. Children thought they were fairy antlers, while old woodsmen took them as signs of healthy soil and shaded ground. The Wrinkled Club wasn't edible, nor was it used in remedies, but it carried an understated charm. It belonged to that group of mushrooms that existed more for wonder than utility, adding texture to the forest's hidden world. Elegant Stinkhorn. The elegant stinkhorn was a mushroom of contradictions, graceful in form yet foul in smell. Its pale, egg-like body would crack open to reveal a tall, slender stalk capped with a slimy olive-green tip. Found mostly in sandy soils, especially near dunes, it startled walkers with its sudden, almost overnight appearance. In old coastal communities of Europe, people called it everything from witch's finger to sand devil, both fascinated and repulsed by its bizarre growth. Children dared each other to poke at it, while older folks shook their heads, convinced it was a sign of bad luck. Despite its grotesque odor, it was once relatively common in shifting sands and coastal scrub, thriving in the wild, undisturbed edges of the land. Saffron Drop Bonnet. The saffron drop bonnet was a tiny woodland jewel, unremarkable at first glance until broken. Its fragile orange cap and slender stem oozed a brilliant saffron-colored latex when damaged, glowing like liquid fire in the dim forest light. For children exploring the woods, this felt like magic, as if the mushroom bled sunlight. Old naturalists delighted in showing it off, describing its hidden color in field notes and drawings. Though small and inedible, it captured imaginations, adding a sense of discovery to a simple walk in the woods. Once it could be found scattered across damp leaf litter in old forests, a reminder that the tiniest things could carry hidden wonders. Scarlet Elfcup. The Scarlet Elfcup was a burst of color in the gray months, a winter and early spring mushroom that lit up damp woodland floors with its brilliant red cups. Nestled in moss or decaying twigs, it looked like scattered petals, as if fairies had dropped their goblets among the leaves. In folklore, these tiny cups were said to belong to woodland spirits who drank morning dew from them, and children delighted in finding them during walks with their parents. Old herbalists even used them in remedies, claiming the bright flesh carried healing energy against winter ailments. For centuries, the Scarlet Elfcup was a small but familiar sight, reminding people that even in the darkest season, the earth still held surprises. But with the clearing of ancient forests and the loss of moist, shaded habitats, the Elfcups grew scarce. White Ferula mushroom. In the stony pastures of the Mediterranean, shepherds once knew the white Ferula mushroom as a springtime gift. It grew at the base of giant fennel plants, those towering stalks that dotted scrubby hillsides. The mushroom was thick, meaty, and fragrant, a favorite for rustic cooking long before supermarkets and imports replaced the old diets. Families prized them for their hearty flavor, often roasting them over coals or folding them into stews that carried the scent of wild herbs and wood smoke. But like so many treasures tied to specific plants, the white Ferula mushroom began to fade as its partner plant declined. With fields cleared and traditional grazing practices abandoned, the habitat withered. Younger generations never had the chance to taste what their grandparents did, an earthy mushroom linked inseparably to a wild ancient landscape. Chestnut polypore. The chestnut polypore once spread across forest floors like polished mahogany plates, their deep brown caps glowing against fallen leaves. It wasn't flashy, but it carried a quiet importance. Apothecaries and herbalists valued it centuries ago, grinding it into powders believed to treat everything from wounds to stomach ailments. Old remedies often included a slice of this mushroom tucked into pouches or boiled into tonics. For rural families, it was part of a folk tradition where every plant and fungus had its place in the medicine chest. But modern medicine and industrial forestry pushed it aside. As old-growth woods were logged and replaced with managed stands, the chestnut polypore's home shrank. Without the decaying logs and undisturbed soils it craved, its numbers dwindled. Now it's almost forgotten, remembered only in obscure herbal texts and by mushroom enthusiasts who mourn its scarcity. If you could bring back one of these vanished mushrooms, which would it be? Let us know in the comments below, and if you have ever seen any of these in person, please subscribe and see you in the next one.